I am the editorial director of Medscape Psychiatry and Neurology. I'm glad to be here today. Thank you for being here as well. So today we have something different for Instagram Live. You might call it a follow-up to our Medscape book club. A couple months ago, I interviewed Dr. Umane Du from Harvard. She's a nutritional psychiatrist at Harvard, and I'll keep an eye out for her. She should be joining. And I interviewed her about her book, This Is Your Brain on Food, which is everything you really need to know about how what we eat affects our brain, and how it affects our rates of mental illness, and it's really just a trove of information. So to reciprocate, Uma's going to be talking to me today about my recent book, A History of the Human Brain, it's right back here, which is really a look at how our brains evolved and the factors that led to our brain's evolution. So without further ado, I will try to get Uma in here. So we'll be talking about how our brains evolved, and also specifically about how nutrition affected our brain evolution. Okay, we're going to get Uma Du. There she is. Hello,
Hi,
Dr. Du. How are
how
you?
are you? I'm good. How are you?
Good to see you. We had a lot of requests to join, so yours got buried there for a minute.
That's
But
okay. It's awesome to see you.
it's great seeing you. And like I was telling them, you're an accomplished nutritional psychiatrist at Harvard, and you recently wrote a book called "This Is Your Brain on Food,"
I
which
did.
which we
Thank
interviewed
you.
you about a few months ago. So thank you for reciprocating here.
Absolutely. I've so been enjoying your book. So thank you for this great copy. And, it was awesome. I enjoyed speaking to you about my book a little while ago, and I think you saved that on the Instagram feed. And we can talk about that in a second. But, I loved not only the cover. Let me start there. So you told me once this is actually a brain scan, right?
That is a brain scan
Let's
that
start there.
they photoshopped. Obviously, our brains are not
Right.
that color,
They're not that color, right?
Indeed.
Those are the colors of the rainbow that I talk about in food all the time. But no,
Exactly.
that's not the
Eat the
color of our
rainbow.
brain.
Well, thank you for having me. Yeah, your book is excellent, and I appreciate reciprocating. And I think there's a lot of overlap in our books in terms of how our evolution, how diet played such a big role in our brain evolution, which
Right.
is still so relevant today.
Absolutely. So, tell us a little bit, firstly, for a lot of people, when I talk about nutritional psychiatry, don't always know the term because it is more nascent. Evolutionary psychiatry is much better understood and known. So tell us a little bit kind of how you would define that.
Sure. I mean, I think of evolutionary psychiatry as how our psyches evolved, certainly in comparison with other species, and one of the big questions I have is, why were mental illnesses conserved through evolution?
Right.
You would think that, having severe anxiety or depression or schizophrenia would have been weeded out because they can be so detrimental to our health and would have impaired our chances of survival and reproducing and passing on our genes. But a lot of evolutionary psychologists talk
Hmm.
about the fact that, in moderation, a lot of these traits, these cognitive traits are beneficial. As a certain
Yeah,
degree of anxiety is obviously, we need that to run away from the
absolutely.
lion on the
That's
plane,
right.
and then a certain degree of depression has been associated with empathy and caring
Hmm.
for others. Nasir
Hmm.
Gaimi at Tufts and Harvard has written about
Hmm.
this in the past, and but so I think that a lot of these mental traits and the evolution of our psychiatry comes from beneficial conserved qualities
Right.
that when at their extremes become pathologies. Like extreme
Abs-
depression is not good, extreme anxiety is not good for us, but a little bit is probably okay.
Absolutely. Let me just step in for a second and say you're absolutely right, because what people don't often realize is that a certain level of anxiety, which if you talk about it through sort of a stress diathesis model, would be called eustress. That's spelled EUSTRESS. And that's sort of, the stress before an exam, medical school and board exams and that kind of stuff. You and I know that very well. And if you're staying up to study to get through that exam the next morning, and push through, that kind of stress is functional. It's helping you get to a goal. But
Sure.
it's when that type of stress just flips over into, and it is from evolutionary times, right? Because our bodies are built that way in order to flee the lion, just like our bodies are sort of programmed in a way to like sugar. And part of
Right.
that is that it's a quick source of energy and we can bolt from, again, from that lion, from that predator. But at the same time, we have to now adjust in evolution, like you're speaking about, because when the eustress flips over and it becomes dysfunctional to your life is when you're struggling with anxiety. So I really appreciate what you're saying, because I think that so much of our understanding is, through the evolution, not only the science, but the evolutionary biology. So, I also feel like I like the subtitle to your book, by the way, which is from the sea sponge to CRISPR, how our brain evolved. So it's really, really cool. Tell us a little bit about the research that you went into, or your review of the literature to kind of put the book together.
Sure. So when I was approached to write this book, after a few months of brainstorming, I decided to write a history of the human brain, starting from cell one and how DNA got here and how the cell got here,
Okay.
which was probably stupid in hindsight. It was too big of a task to do in 11 months. But when I started researching, the evolution of the neuron, say, and how cells communicate, and it became clear, and it's agreed upon among neuroscientists, that sponges, the sea sponge, which was probably the first animal to evolve on Earth about 700 million years ago, their cells communicate much in the same way that ours do, with many of the same neurotransmitters. I believe GABA, glutamate. So even though they're not neurons, and sponges don't possess a brain per se, their cells do communicate with neurotransmitters.
Mm-hmm.
So in a way, you could think of the sea sponge as that first inkling of having a communicative network of cells that would one day evolve into an animal brain.
Right. It's amazing. It's amazing to bring it all the way to CRISPR, right?
Yeah, so that was the task. I knew I wanted to start with the sea sponge once I learned that, and then kind of walk through. I mean, to tell the story of the brain, you have to just walk through animal and mammalian evolution and how cephalization happens and why our sensory organs wound up on one end of our body.
Mm-hmm.
And that was beneficial to our worm-like ancestors, and then fish, and then amphibians, and reptiles, and so forth. So it was really just such a gradual, classic Darwinian process of cells becoming more communicative with each other in more complex ways. They gathered together in a proto-brain or a proto-photoreceptor, which would become an eye, and eventually we developed myelin, the axons of our neurons, which allow them to communicate much better, much more effectively.
Right.
So that's the story of the book, really, is how all that happened, and then where our brains might be going with many of the influences of modern culture and technologies like CRISPR, where we can literally alter our genomes, including genes involved in brain development and certain traits. Yeah, the good and the bad.
Absolutely. I love that. It's a fantastic read. And one of the things I was curious about as a nutritional psychiatrist, because of the work that I do, is did you find connections between the brain and the gut that were part of this evolution in terms of your research? And did you find anything about that unusual, different, interesting?
Yeah, I mean, as you know, most of our serotonin is produced in our gut, and there's certainly such an important connection between how the brain functions and the microbiome and our GI system. And, it's hard to research that in 2 million-year-old fossils, so a lot of it is speculatory, but you can clearly tell what we ate over the past many millions of years based on radio dating teeth from, Homo erectus. I mean, we're dating way back, millions and millions of years. So clearly, I think our diet, probably through the same mechanisms it does today, by interacting with our central nervous system, had a very clear effect on what happened to our brain and how it evolved. I think, it would just probably be impossible to tell what that is, but
Right, to define exactly what the eating or what the foods were, or we can only surmise that. So I agree with that. What about the sort of impact on, you mentioned in modern day times, right? So our brains are affected by so many different things. I get asked this question all the time. And to be honest, Brett, I was very much a purist when I started in the field of nutritional psychiatry. And I was like, whole foods all the time, nutrients whenever you can, no supplements. And I really have learned that, because of things like air pollution, all types of pollution, environmental stresses, just physical stress in the world, genes, genome, the whole ecosystem in which we exist in the world it's very hard for us to eat a perfect meal. You know, we might
Sure.
try and I think make the best efforts to eat good meals and healthy foods, but there still might be nutritional gaps. And that's where I think there is a place for supplementation. So I'm curious, you know, what you feel in terms of the evolution of where we are now. What is it that our brains are exposed to that could potentially change things moving forward?
Sure, and that's sort of where my book ends, trying to encourage readers to think about, where our brains might be going. And I think that one of the big points is that our cultural evolution has whizzed by our biological
Yeah.
evolution. I mean, we are evolving in a Darwinian sense, but incredibly slowly compared to the rapidity of a culture. And just so I think the psychological evolution of responding to things like technology and social media, that's a nanosecond on the biological time scale,
Hmm.
but it's having such clear influence on how we, say, interact and socialize. um, so I do think, and a lot of scientists think, that this could have meaningful, changes on our biology through, say, epigenetics, where our genomes are modified through environmental exposures like pollution
Hmm.
or how we socialize, what we
Right.
eat.
Right.
So a lot of researchers think the global diet, which despite, farm to table food movements in wealthier countries, it's still fairly unhealthy on a mass scale. It's hard
Right.
to feed 8 billion people with
Hmm.
a healthy diet. So,
Hmm.
that could have meaningful changes on our biology and our brain evolution.
Right.
Um, and then, people like Steven Pinker, your colleague at Harvard, get into this about how do we evolve biologically? How do our brains evolve
Mm.
biologically? And that can be through atrocities, genocide and war. If you wipe out a huge percentage of a
Yeah.
genome, the collective genome has changed. So there are ways in which we evolve. And I think local migrations are another way in which our brain is going to evolve. And this was
Hmm.
put forth by Simon Baron-Cohen, neuroscientist in
Okay.
London,
Hmm.
Sacha Baron Cohen's brother, who plays Borat. So an interesting family.
Interesting.
um, his thoughts are that like-minded people, tend to move to specific locations. He talks about Silicon Valley and traits that are make good for computer programming and mathematics and things like that. And you tend to pair off with people in your location, so that
Hmm.
that over time will change literally the
It's
genetic
fascinating.
makeup of our brain. Yeah, so
Yeah.
it's hard to tell because there's so many influences at play. But I think that the way culture is rapidly changing will affect our brains.
Absolutely. So, and a lot of people are asking, so I'm just going to update people about what we're doing. We're hosting a book club on Medscape for Dr. Brett Stetka's new book, uh, which is fantastic. And I would recommend people read it. It's a history
Thank
of the
you.
human brain, from sea sponge to CRISPR, how our brain evolved. And we're definitely going to save this chat so that people can hear about it and understand.
Thank you.
Uh,
Appreciate it.
of course. And so, one of the things in my work, and my book is called This Is Your Brain on Food, in the work that I do, I've really grown to understand in the here and now, just picking up on something you said, that the way that we're eating globally has not only changed with the welcoming of fast foods all across the world, especially in parts of Asia, where
Right.
there hadn't been in some parts of Asia that type of issue with weight. And because of that, now, kids are flocking to eat fast foods like
Fast food,
us
right?
Americans do.
McDonald's,
And
yeah.
unfortunately, these are laden with highly processed ingredients, processed vegetable oils, which are pro-inflammatory to the gut. A ton of added sugars. I've said a million times, like French fries from fast food restaurants actually have sugar. You don't taste it, but
Right.
they're there through research and development to make them extra yummy so that, you upsize. Then when you buy the larger size, you can't put it down. So it's all engineered that way. And a
Yeah.
study in the journal Nutrients, in I think February of this year, talked about how ultra processed foods are so highly addictive. So you're absolutely right. Our brains have also changed as we've changed what we eat. So the fact that there's high fructose corn syrup in so many things that we eat, we're just consuming much more sugar. Now, sugar is not to be demonized. They're natural sugars which are important for our body, but this has changed our brain. This has changed how we function. The greater levels of it certainly impacted us during COVID, with the premorbid conditions such as obesity and type 2 diabetes, as well as several others that placed people at higher risk. And then when people did live and survive COVID, they have a higher level of long-term side effects like brain fog and long COVID symptoms, brain fog being the one that people are most concerned about,
Right.
and as well as just more complications of mental health. So, I care deeply about destigmatizing mental health and making it part of the conversation. And I think in terms of evolution and where our brain is at, the way that we eat, as well as all the other influences you speak about in your book, have really brought us to this point. In that context, are there things that you feel, based on your research and your work, that we could be doing differently to help ourselves, to help our, let's say, our development moving forward?
Sure, I get at this in the book, and I've written a couple follow-up articles about it. Basically, one of the theses in my book is, if you look back at the influences on our brain that really shaped it, that sort of, I don't want to say led us to win out against all the other hominins or members of Homo and other primates, but it was our omnivorism. We eat just about anything compared to most species. Most species don't eat meat and seafood and vegetables and fruits and nuts,
Everything.
and mushrooms. So along the way, there's evidence based on, again, radiodating teeth from Australopithecines and some of our long lost cousins, where they couldn't endure climate changes and climate shifts. So if we look back, we sort of left the African canopy probably 2 to 3 million years ago due to climate change. Africa dried up. We were pushed out onto the plain where we were competing with lions, and it was dangerous. But we could go back and forth, and we did for a long time. There's proof of that. We could eat the fruits of the forest. We could dig up roots out on the plains.
Right.
We start hunting. We start scavenging. We could eat meat. A lot of us access shellfish and marine nutrients, which many researchers think saved our lives, which is in my book as well. Literally shucking oysters and mussels may have saved the Homo sapiens. We were down to a couple thousand individuals at one point, which fascinated me. So that was another part of the book.
That's fascinating, actually, yeah.
So I think that, and if you look at what's healthy today for our brain, it's that. It's an omnivorous, healthy diet with balanced nutrients. It's socializing, being interactive, and primates have always been an incredibly social species, even back with simians and monkeys, and certainly chimpanzees and bonobos. Very social, huge social groups, very complex interaction, and that's healthy for us today, as you know, and creativity and challenging our brain to new things. That's how we got here. That was what selection acted on our intelligence, because we weren't the strongest on the plains. The lions were, the cheetahs were. Our benefit was that we were smart. That's what kept us around. And so challenging our brain today, whether that's people talk about crosswords, but if you're already good at crosswords, that's not doing anything. You got to take something new, like an instrument. Sudoku, yeah. Just challenge your brain to anything. So
anything different, to something new. Play a musical instrument, or I have a friend who's learning classical piano. Who's a medical student, and it's just a great way to kind of exercise the muscle that is your brain. But I totally agree with what you're saying, and I feel like we on one hand, one way to nurture our brain and to create the nutrient density, and I want to go back to the seafood and shucking oysters and stuff, is that we talk about omega-3 fatty acids, which are most easily and readily are available in things like fatty fish, like salmon, sardines, anchovies, things like that. But they also are plant-based sources, less available, less bioavailable, but still there, in things like walnuts and chia seeds and flax seeds and sea vegetables. But I would love to go back to the point you made about how maybe seafood saved our lives, because I think you do. I think that point was something I had picked up on in the book, which is that the fact that we eat everything, some certain people may be vegetarian. I happen to be raised vegetarian. That was just part of how my family was. But for the most part, people just eat everything, and I love that about it, because I think that with the more we can change this diet culture that we live in, and this let's eat this and not that, and kind of excluding foods, the healthier our brains will be. But it's about finding the balance for your own unique microbiome, which is like a thumbprint and that type of thing. But tell us about the seafood piece.
Sure. So this will resonate with you, I think, because, way back when it's assumed that it wasn't about specific foods or nutrients. Say 2 million years ago in Homo erectus, we only lived to be 30, 35. Diabetes wasn't a concern because we didn't live long enough to get it. Alzheimer's wasn't a concern. So it was about, we just needed to survive. So we would eat anything. We just needed calories. And then as we evolved, specific nutrients seemed to have started playing a much bigger role in our brain health. And the one that people have pointed to since the 1970s, starting with this researcher Michael Crawford in England, was omega-3s and iodine and these marine nutrients. And his whole point is our brains evolved at sea 500 million years ago from sea nutrients. That was all that was available. Everything had to be in the sea. So it makes logical sense that today those ingredients are healthy for the brain. But fast forward to 150,000 or so years ago, and like I said, our population had shrunk probably to just a few thousand Homo sapiens. And at that time, at least in some of us, the ones on the African coast, south and east, you start finding fossilized oyster shells and sea snail shells and mussels. So we clearly had started accessing shellfish beds around then. And also there's evidence of inland fish eating from lakes in us and Neanderthals, actually. Right. So we really, by that point, we started accessing marine nutrients and fish and seafood, and then our population relatively quickly, in evolutionary terms, skyrockets over the next 40 or 50,000 years. I doubt it was the only factor, but I think it was certainly a factor that this food source was very healthy for our brain and our cognition, right. And it didn't hurt that it was probably high in calories too, a lot of fats.
A lot of but supposedly healthy fats, which I think is good. Exactly, that's great. And some of the questions and remarks coming through. We're talking here about your book, which is A History of the Human Brain, and really its evolution. I am a nutritional psychiatrist, and I wrote a book called This Is Your Brain and Food. And I say that right because a lot of questions about whether seafood or different types of foods. I don't demonize food. Right. Food is actually part of how we live. It is a lifestyle. Nutrition is part of a lifestyle factor. It is not, you have to go on a diet. You have to see a special person to learn to eat a proper diet. It's really about finding our way forward for our best brain health. And to address that question more specifically, I think people need to understand it's not about excluding seafood or excluding, meat or excluding or being a certain, if you have very strong feelings, absolutely you should respect that, and we respect that.
For sure,
and do that. But it's really about finding the healthiest food. And this conversation has really been your sharing the evolution of our brain, and bringing in some mental health pieces. We're talking about how, from prehistoric times to now, and I'm no expert in this area, but I've learned so much from you. Our brain has evolved. So this is really not about telling people eat walnuts or eat, salmon.
Sure, yeah.
It's about the understanding the development of the brain and where we're at today. And I think one of the most important things is how do we move ourselves forward through just some healthy principles of eating a healthy whole foods diet. Maybe you eat seafood, maybe you don't, maybe you eat mostly a plant-rich diet, maybe you're vegan, whatever it is, do that. And what I talk about is body intelligence, which is if you eat something you don't feel good, pay attention to that, because your brain is giving you information. And it's one way, but people who have questions about different foods, check out my Instagram at Dr. Uma Naidu, where you'll find more information. But Brett, the question I want to end on today, and I congratulate you again on your excellent book, because I know it's a lot of work. It's a labor of love to write a book, actually.
It is.
Is just a little bit about your history, because you're a physician, but you actually pivoted into this really cool role with Medscape, being one of the lead editors. And tell us a little bit about how that happened for you, and then the link to the book.
Sure. So it was definitely unplanned. So I went to medical school at the University of Virginia, and I knew I'd always been interested in the brain. My dad had been a geneticist, and so I was always into science. And then I got to college, maybe even high school, and took a few biology courses where it was clear that the brain was the last frontier in biology in terms of how our bodies work. And it was just so fascinating, and it was kind of an enigma to me. So in med school, I I thought I would go into neurology and or psychiatry. So I did a lot of neuroscience research. I worked on MS, Parkinson's, and before residency match, I was completely undecided which field I wanted to do. I was in a neuropathology lab at that time with my mentor, Jim Mandel. And so I decided to take a year off and do a research postdoc at Mount Sinai in New York City, thinking I'd enter match the next year. And that did not happen. The PI in the lab was Italian and didn't speak the best English, so I ended up writing most of the papers. And it was partially a writing postdoc as well. And I just loved writing about medicine and science, it turned out, and hadn't really done it before. And I'd always had a creative bent. I was a music minor, jazz guitar minor, and so it felt like this perfect compromise of a sort of a creative side meets my interest in science. So I applied for this job at Medscape thinking it would be temporary, needed some money, and I really loved it. And then ended up taking some freelance jobs for NPR and Scientific American, who I still write for. And, 5 years in, I was like, well, I guess I'm not going to practice medicine because I've turned this into a career. I felt very guilty about it for a while. My parents thought I was nuts, but it worked out. I got lucky and it turned it into a career. So that's how I got here. And
that's awesome. Congratulations. I just think it's fascinating because I think that, writing does not come naturally to people. It's actually pretty difficult to put stuff together. So the fact that you honored that in yourself and pivoted to have this great career, I think is awesome. Congratulations on your book.
I appreciate it. And back at you, you've managed to sort of do both as well. And your book's incredible and very successful. So congrats to you. And and we're glad to have you on Medscape.
Thank you. And we'll be back to do more fun stuff. So to answer some questions that people are asking, we're discussing, this is more of a book club. We're discussing a book that Dr. Brett Stetka wrote. Please check it out. It's right behind him. And it's called A History of the Human Brain. Brett, tell us where people can find you and where they can find the book.
Sure. Amazon, Barnes & Noble, bookshop.org, all the places you can buy books online. And it's at most local bookshops. Anywhere you buy books, hopefully it's available.
Excellent.
And there's an audiobook as well, and a Kindle if you prefer those formats.
That's awesome. I actually end up listening to a lot of books when I'm driving, so that's cool.
Me too.
Great. Well, great to see you, and we'll be in touch. We'll be back to do something else fun in the future.
Sounds good, Uma. Really appreciate it. Thank you for coming.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.